The Lady of White Rock Lake. The night was thick with humidity as we drove through the winding roads near White Rock Lake. The moon hung low, casting a silvery reflection on the water's surface, broken only by the occasional ripple. We were supposed to be enjoying the serenity of it all. A spontaneous late-night drive to clear our heads from the week's chaos. But there was an unease in the air, something we couldn't quite shake. My girlfriend Emily sat beside me in the passenger seat, her fingers absently tapping against the door. The radio hummed softly, barely audible over the rumble of the engine and the croaking of frogs outside. We hadn't said much in the last few minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we rounded a sharp bend, something made Emily suck in a breath. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but laced with tension. I glanced at her, then followed her gaze toward the edge of the road. There, illuminated by the soft glow of our headlights, stood a figure. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. She was soaked, water dripping from the hem of her dress, pooling around her bare feet. "Holy, do you think she needs help?" Emily asked, already reaching for the door handle. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed to drive away, but there was something in the woman's eyes. Something pleading. I pulled over to the side of the road, and before I could stop her, Emily was out of the car, walking towards the woman. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice cutting through the night. The woman didn't respond at first. She just stood there, staring at us with those hollow eyes. And then slowly she raised a hand and pointed towards the lake. My skin prickled with unease. "I was in an accident," the woman said, her voice soft and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Can you give me a ride home?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. But Emily, ever the kind-hearted one, nodded and gestured for her to come closer. The woman moved towards us, her steps slow and deliberate, the sound of water squishing with every step she took. She climbed into the back seat without another word, and as soon as she sat down, I felt the dampness seep into the car. Emily got back in, and I turned around in my seat to ask the woman where she lived. But when I looked at her in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. She wasn't there. The back seat was empty, but the wet spot remained, spreading across the fabric, dark and cold. I turned to Emily, who was staring at the same spot with wide eyes. "Did you?" she started, but I cut her off. "Let's go, now." I floored the gas, the tires screeching against the pavement as we sped away from the lake. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing with what we just experienced. Emily was silent, her breath quick and shallow. We didn't talk for the rest of the drive. When we got home, we sat in the car for a long moment, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what had just happened. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "We have to know who she was. We can't just leave it like this." I shook my head. "Em, that wasn't a normal person. But what if she needs our help? What if she's stuck, like a spirit trapped here because no one knows her story?" I wanted to argue, to tell her that we should forget about it and move on. But deep down, I knew she was right. We had to know. We had to find out who she was and why she appeared to us. The curiosity was overwhelming, like a seed planted in my mind that refused to stop growing. So, against my better judgment, we decided to return to White Rock Lake the next night. Not just to drive by, but to look deeper. To find out what had happened to the woman in white. We didn't realize then that uncovering the truth would be the worst mistake we'd ever make. Because some stories are better left buried, and some spirits aren't looking for peace. They're looking for revenge. The next evening, we returned to White Rock Lake just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cooler this time, a light breeze rustling through the trees as the lake sat still, eerily calm. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into something we weren't prepared for. But Emily was determined, and I couldn't let her do this alone. We parked in the same spot as the night before, the area now shrouded in shadows. The place felt different in the dark, more oppressive, as if the lake itself was watching us. Emily stepped out of the car first, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Let's start by asking around," she said. "Maybe someone's seen her before." We walked towards a small cluster of people near the lakeside, mostly fishermen and a few late joggers. I let Emily do the talking. We approached an older man who was packing up his gear, his weathered face creased with years of sun exposure. "Excuse me," Emily began. "Have you ever seen a woman in white around here? Someone who might be lost?" The man paused, his hands stilling on his fishing rod. His eyes flicked up to meet ours, and something in his expression shifted. Something darker, more cautious. "You're not the first to ask about her," he said quietly. "People have been seeing her for decades. Some say she's a ghost. Some say she's just a figment of your imagination. But I wouldn't go looking for her if I were you." "Why not?" Emily pressed. "What happened to her?" The man glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say she drowned here. Long time ago. some kind of accident, but no one really knows for sure. Every so often she shows up, asking for a ride home. People have tried to help her, but they never come back the same, if they come back at all. A chill ran down my spine. The man straightened up and gave us a long, hard look. If you're smart, you'll leave this place alone. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving us standing there in the fading light. Emily's resolve didn't waver, though. She was more determined than ever. "We need to find out more," she said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. "There has to be a record of what happened. Maybe we can go to the library tomorrow and check old news archives." I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed to stop. But Emily had that look in her eye, the one that told me she wouldn't quit until she got answers. So we got back in the car and headed home, planning our next steps. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow eyes staring back at me, the water dripping from her dress. I kept hearing the old man's warning echo in my head. Asterisk if they come back at all. Asterisk. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But it wasn't peaceful. I dreamt of the lake, dark and bottomless, the water lapping at my feet as I stood at the edge. In the distance, I saw her, pale and ghostly, her dress trailing in the water. She was closer than before, her features clearer. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but her eyes were filled with rage. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily was still asleep beside me, oblivious to the nightmare I just had. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m., the witching hour. I got up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to shake off the lingering terror. But as I stood by the sink staring out the window into the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the porch light, was the woman in white. She was drenched, her hair hanging in wet strands around her face, and she was staring straight at me. I stumbled back, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. I blinked and she was gone, but the wet footprints on the porch remained, slowly evaporating in the cool night air. I stood frozen, my mind racing. She wasn't just at the lake anymore. She had followed us home. When I finally gathered the courage to go back to bed, I didn't tell Emily. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But deep down, I knew that whatever we had started, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day, we went to the library as planned, poring over old newspapers and microfilm in search of any clue about the woman. Hours passed, and we were about to give up when Emily found something. A small article, buried in the back pages of a local paper from the 1950s. Young woman found drowned in White Rock Lake. Police suspect accident. The article was brief, almost dismissive, but the details matched the ghost we had seen. A name stood out, * Clara Hayes. Asterisk. We had found her, but as we stared at the faded text, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't just a tragic story. There was something more to it. Something darker. Something the article didn't mention. And whatever it was, we were about to dig it up. As we left the library, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, clouds rolling in like an impending storm. Emily clutched the article in her hand, her expression a mix of determination and fear. "We have to go back tonight," she said. "We have to try to talk to her." I nodded, though every part of me screamed that it was a terrible idea. But we had come this far, and there was no turning back now. We were in too deep. As we drove back to the lake, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the windshield like a warning. The road ahead seemed darker than before, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels, and in the distance, through the haze of rain, I could see the lake. A dark, endless void that seemed to call out to us. We parked in the same spot as before, the rain now coming down in sheets. Emily stepped out of the car first, her shoulders squared as she walked towards the edge of the water. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding in my chest. The lake was calm, unnaturally so, as if the storm raging above had no power here. We stood at the water's edge, the article clutched in Emily's hand, waiting for something. Anything. And then we saw her. The woman in white appeared again, her form slowly emerging from the shadows, her dress trailing in the water. She was closer this time, her features more defined. Her eyes locked onto ours, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. "Clara?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at us with those hollow eyes. And then slowly she raised a hand and pointed towards the water, towards something just below the surface. Without thinking, Emily moved forward, wading into the lake despite my protests. She reached down into the water, her fingers brushing against something solid. She pulled it up, and I saw what she had found. A small, rusted locket, covered in mud and algae. As soon as Emily touched the locket, the air around us grew colder. The wind howled through the trees, and the lake began to ripple, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The woman's expression changed, her once pleading eyes now filled with anger, her mouth twisting into a snarl. "Emily, we need to go!" I shouted, but she didn't move. She was frozen in place, her eyes locked onto the woman in white. And then, without warning, the woman lunged at her. The woman in white lunged at Emily with a speed that defied logic, her ghostly form blurring in the rain as she reached out with waterlogged hands. I grabbed Emily's arm and yanked her back just in time, pulling her out of the lake and onto the muddy shore. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, the storm overhead intensifying as if in response to the spirit's fury. Emily was gasping for breath, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched the rusted locket in her hand. The woman in white hovered just above the surface of the water, her face twisted in rage, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to scream. But no sound came out. Instead, an oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. "We need to get out of here!" I shouted over the noise of the storm, but Emily wasn't listening. She was staring at the locket in her hand, her face pale and haunted. She wants this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. This was hers. "Emily, I don't care! We have to go!" I pulled her to her feet, practically dragging her back to the car as the woman in white watched us, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. We stumbled into the car, slamming the door shut just as the storm broke in full force. The rain pounded against the roof, making it almost impossible to hear anything else. I twisted the key in the ignition, my hands shaking, and the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I floored the gas, the tires slipping on the wet road as we sped away from the lake. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. I glanced at Emily out of the corner of my eye. She was still gripping the locket, her knuckles white, her eyes unfocused. "What the hell just happened back there?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. Emily didn't answer right away. She stared down at the locket in her hand, her brow furrowed in thought. I think this was hers. Clara's. It must have been important to her. Maybe that's why she can't move on." I shook my head. "This isn't some ghost story we can solve by returning a lost item, Em. That thing, she's dangerous. You saw her, she tried to—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of Clara's enraged face lunging at Emily played over and over in my mind, searing itself into my thoughts. "I know," Emily whispered. "But what if we're the ones who disturbed her? What if we're the reason she's so angry now? Maybe if we bring the locket back to where she died, we can help her find peace." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty road. "Are you serious? You want to go asterisk back asterisk there? After what just happened?" Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with a strange determination. "We're already involved. We can't just run away. If we don't do something, she'll keep haunting us. And who knows what she's capable of." I wanted to argue, to tell her that we should just forget about the whole thing and move on with our lives. But deep down, I knew she was right. The woman in white wasn't going to leave us alone, not after tonight. And if there was even a chance that returning the locket could help, we had to take it. With a resigned sigh, I turned the car around and headed back towards White Rock Lake. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees as lightning streaked across the sky. The closer we got to the lake, the heavier the air felt, like the very atmosphere was pressing down on us. When we arrived, the lake was shrouded in mist, the water churning restlessly beneath the storm. We parked the car and stepped out into the rain, the wind whipping at our clothes as we made our way back to the shore. Emily clutched the locket tightly in her hand as we approached the water's edge. The lake seemed darker now, more menacing, as if it was hiding something beneath its surface. I scanned the area, half expecting the woman in white to appear again, but the lake remained still. "Here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "This is where she wants it." She knelt down at the edge of the water, her hand trembling as she held the locket over the lake. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and then, with a deep breath, she let the locket slip from her fingers and fall into the water. The moment the locket hit the surface, the wind died down and the lake grew eerily calm. The rain continued to fall, but it was softer now, almost gentle. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But then, something changed. The water began to ripple, slowly at first, then more violently, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. Emily took a step back, her eyes wide with fear as the ripples grew larger, spreading out across the lake. And then we saw her. Clara emerged from the water, her white dress clinging to her body, her hair dripping with lake water. But this time, she wasn't just an apparition. She was solid, real, and she was coming towards us. I grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back as Clara stepped out of the lake, her eyes locked onto ours. There was no anger in her expression now, just an overwhelming sadness that seemed to radiate from her. She raised a hand, pointing at something behind us. I turned slowly and my heart nearly stopped. There, lying in the mud at the edge of the trees, was a skeleton. The bones were half buried in the earth, overgrown with weeds and roots, but unmistakably human. And clutched in the bony fingers was another locket, identical to the one Emily had found in the lake. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She wasn't the only one. Before I could respond, Clara let out a low, mournful wail that echoed across the lake, her voice filled with unimaginable pain. The air around us grew colder, and the ground beneath our feet began to shake. The bones in the mud started to move. The skeleton was rising, the bones rattling and creaking as it pulled itself free from the earth. I watched in horror as the empty eye sockets turned towards us, the jaw creaking open in a silent scream. Clara stepped forward, her hand reaching out towards the skeletal figure, as if trying to communicate with it. But whatever she was trying to do, it wasn't working. The skeleton lunged at her, its bony fingers grasping at her throat, and for the first time, Clara's expression changed from sadness to terror. Emily and I stood frozen, unable to move, as the two figures struggled at the water's edge. Clara's form flickered, shifting between solid and ethereal as the skeleton's grip tightened around her throat. And then with a final desperate wail, Clara was dragged down into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface along with the skeleton. The water rippled violently for a moment, then went still. The air was silent. The storm had passed. We stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where Clara had vanished. The lake was calm now, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. But the memory of what we had just witnessed would haunt me forever. "We have to leave," I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Emily nodded silently, her eyes filled with tears. We turned and walked back to the car, not daring to look back at the lake. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And deep down, I knew that this wasn't over. The drive home was a blur. The storm had passed, but a thick fog now blanketed the roads, twisting the familiar streets into something unfamiliar, something sinister. Neither Emily nor I spoke. We were both lost in the horror of what we'd witnessed, the images replaying in my mind over and over. Clara's desperate wail, the skeletal hand gripping her throat, the water swallowing them both whole. When we finally reached our house, I parked the car and just sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. The air inside the car was heavy, suffocating, as if the events at the lake had followed us home. Emily still had the locket clutched in her hand, her knuckles white against the tarnished metal. She hadn't let go since she fished it from the lake, even as we drove away from the nightmare behind us. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my voice barely breaking the silence. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were distant, lost in some faraway place. Finally she nodded, but it was mechanical, as if she wasn't entirely sure herself. We did what we could," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "It's over now. We just need to move on." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. There was no moving on from something like this. Not after what we'd seen, what we'd been a part of. The sense of unease clung to me like a dark cloud that wouldn't dissipate. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that something had followed us home. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept expecting to see her. Clara standing in the shadows, watching us, waiting for something. But the hours dragged on, and nothing happened. Emily had finally fallen asleep beside me, her breathing slow and even. I envied her ability to find some semblance of peace after everything that had happened. But just as I was starting to drift off, something woke me. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of dripping water. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, but I could hear it clearly now. The slow, steady drip of water, as if something was leaking just outside the bedroom door. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I couldn't just ignore it. Carefully, I slipped out of bed, trying not to wake Emily. I crept towards the door, the sound growing louder with each step. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the living room window. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the hall. The dripping sound was louder now, coming from the kitchen. I walked slowly, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I hesitated, fear gnawing at my insides. But I couldn't stop now. I flicked on the light and froze. Standing in the middle of the kitchen, soaked from head to toe, was Clara. Her wet dress clung to her pale skin, her hair matted and dripping onto the floor. Her back was to me, but I could see her shoulders rising and falling as if she was struggling to breathe. "Clara," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't move. She just stood there, the water pooling at her feet, spreading across the floor like a dark stain. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Slowly, she began to turn around, and I felt my heart stop in my chest. Her face was twisted, contorted in a grotesque expression of rage and despair. Her eyes, once hollow, were now filled with something far worse, an endless, suffocating darkness. Her mouth opened and a guttural, inhuman sound escaped her lips. It was the sound of pure agony, of torment that had no end. And then she lunged. I stumbled back, my hands scrambling for anything to defend myself with, but she was on me in an instant. Her cold, wet hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing with a strength that defied her frail appearance. I gasped for air, clawing at her fingers, but it was no use. The room spun, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I collapsed to the floor, coughing and choking, struggling to catch my breath. When I looked up, Clara was gone. The kitchen was empty. The only sign of her presence, the wet footprints that trailed across the floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to wake Emily and leave before... A sound behind me made my blood run cold. It was Emily's voice, but wrong. It was too soft, too distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily stood in the doorway, but it wasn't really her. Her eyes were empty, hollow, just like Clara's had been. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung limply around her face, dripping with water. "Emily?" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She stepped towards me, her movements slow, deliberate. "You left me," she said again, her voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "You let me drown." I scrambled to my feet, backing away from her, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as she got closer, I could feel the cold radiating off her. The same icy chill that had clung to Clara at the lake. "Emily, please," I begged, my voice shaking. "This isn't you, this isn't real." But she didn't stop. Her hand reached out towards me, her fingers cold and wet as they brushed against my skin. And then, just as she was about to grab me, something changed. Her expression softened, the emptiness in her eyes fading for just a moment. She blinked and suddenly she was herself again. Emily, my Emily, standing there looking confused and scared. What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. I pulled her into my arms, relief flooding through me. "It's okay," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't. "It's over now." But even as I held her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house felt too quiet, too still, and in the corner of my vision, I saw something, just a flicker, a shadow moving across the room. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Emily pulled away from me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" She shook her head, her eyes scanning the room. "It sounded like someone was whispering." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on Emily's face told me she wasn't imagining it. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Emily gasped, and I reached out to grab her hand. But the moment our fingers touched, the air around us grew cold. I felt it again. That presence, the same one I'd felt at the lake, the same one that had followed us home. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, whispering from somewhere in the dark. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't Emily's. "You'll never leave me." The word sent a chill down my spine. I squeezed Emily's hand, trying to steady my breathing. But the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You'll never leave me." And then the lights came back on. The kitchen was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. But the words lingered in the air, echoing in my mind. Emily looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever we had unleashed, whatever we had brought back with us, it wasn't going to let us go. Not ever. And in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. Clara wasn't just a lost soul looking for peace. She was something much darker, something that fed on fear, on pain, on the lives of those who dared to disturb her. And now she had us. We weren't just haunted, we were trapped, forever.